Thank you everyone for tuning in and welcome to CTOTalk. I am your host, Matt Ferrari. On this 30-minute program today, we're going to discuss the issues, challenges, and opportunities impacting healthcare technology. You can follow the show on Twitter at #CTOTalk or follow me at @MPFerrari. For this episode, I'm really excited to be talking with Saundra Monroe, Senior Product Manager at ClearDATA. And today, we're going to be talking about a really hot topic that's going to be coming up at HIMSS, and realistically, a major topic that's going to be kind of really revealed to healthcare, here in May. So that's GDPR. And so welcome to the show, Saundra.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. So I'd love to kind of start with GDPR and its definition. Could you kind of walk us through, what is GDPR and how does it affect healthcare?
So GDPR is like a general data protection regulation that kind of takes the information you collect on the data subject and takes that and wraps that around regulation. So it allows government entities, or the EU especially, to be able to take that data and make sure that it is protected and puts the data subject's rights at the forefront. Because that's right now, that's one of the biggest concerns, is those data subjects and their rights. So that is what GDPR is taking. All of the member states all have their own data protection regulation, and it's combining all that to bring it into one umbrella so that the data protection is understood across the EU.
Great. And, I'd love to hear, where are you hearing questions about GDPR? Is it specifically from US-based organizations that may have presence in EU? Is it from EU? Where are you starting to hear from, the healthcare market about, some of the things we're going to talk about today?
I think some of the biggest things that we're hearing is across the board. There's a lot of confusion around GDPR. So we're hearing from strictly just U.S. companies, don't have anything to do with EU or any kind of EU data subjets, to companies that are treating patients from the EU and actively recruiting patients from the EU. You think of companies like the Mayo Clinic and big entities that actually treat patients from the EU, bring them over. Or you think of big companies that are definitely in the marketing and storage and locating data. So everybody has their own little piece, and they're kind of a little bit confused on how it affects them. So as we break it down today, that'll be one of the areas we touch on. How, if you fit in one of those categories, where is your structure? Where do you have to comply with GDPR?
Excellent. And I know that, oftentimes healthcare organizations, at least the ones that I talk to, are thinking about HIPAA. They're thinking about all of the regulatory changes. As you think about healthcare organizations, looking at the differences or the gaps between HIPAA and GDPR, where should a healthcare organization begin?
I think the first thing they need to look at, what does HIPAA do and where is their statute? Like we just talked about, if you're strictly in the U.S., you're only regulated by HIPAA, and you know exactly what that means. So you just abide by your HIPAA regulation. But if you fall out of that structure, you need to really look at the gaps between the two. So like GDPR is more consumer-centric. It's right around that data subject, everything around that data subject. It all applies to the data pertaining to citizens from the EU. Where HIPAA is more about an organization. You can even have documentation within an organization where you don't have to abide by HIPAA regulations because the organization doesn't abide by them. So it's all about that organization regulation around the way data is handled for that organization. And a lot of the bigger differences is how that information is handled. So HIPAA allows companies to utilize the data that they have in their own limited purview to the patient. So the patient or the data subject really doesn't know what the data is being used for. Where GDPR needs you to say explicitly what you're using that data for, and does the data subject say it's okay to do that. And some of the other big areas around the data is GDPR has one of the biggest areas that is really, a lot of companies are really struggling with, is that right to be forgotten. It's very explicit about the fact that you have to remove that data. And for a lot of companies, there's not really a clear definition of what that means. And if you're HIPAA, you've dealt with HIPAA before, they don't have that rule. That rule doesn't even exist because that's one of the guidelines that messing with the logs and really getting in that HIPAA is against those kind of regulations. So there's some of the big areas, along with GDPR requires so much transparency to the data subject about the data. So there are some of the big issues around the differences between HIPAA and GDPR that I think a lot of current companies that we've been talking to and really working with, we've really tried to work with our customers and our prospects to say, what do you need help with? How do you need us to help you explain this? And that's what we're working with.
That's extremely helpful. Out of curiosity, when you talk about classifying the data or having to be able to really show the purpose of the data, how does a healthcare organization get their arms wrapped around how to do that? Where do they do that? How do they do that? How should healthcare companies think about that?
So as they think about how they classify that, especially if you're a company that does a lot of any kind of processing in the cloud, you really need to do that data mapping. Where is that data? What part of that data is around GDPR? What part of that data do you have under a HIPAA regulation? And really doing that data mapping so that you understand what that data and information, where it's at and what you're doing with it. That's one of those areas that we've started tackling here at ClearDATA, is being able to take that information and look at what's happening to that data and finding out who's accessing it, where it's stored, what the vulnerability, how it's being transported, who's accessing. So really understanding that full map of what is happening to that data. That's the first thing that has to be done.
That makes sense. Out of curiosity, as you think about, adherence to patient consent, and you think about all of kind of the real world challenges that patients have around signing HIPAA forms and maintaining HIPAA forms, not understanding it, how do you think the patient is going to receive GDPR? What will the experience ultimately look like for them?
I think ultimately, at the end of the day, having the two things that are really going to be other than the right to be forgotten, the other piece that's going to be a struggle is that consent. So having to redo the consent that a patient has, so the patient clearly understands in GDPR, they will clearly understand that transparency of what that data is being used for and what they're consenting for. So there's a strict adherence to that consent inside GDPR, where they don't really have that right now in HIPAA. And so being able to understand, giving that patient or that data subject the ability to really understand what is my data being used for and what am I exposing myself to. Because as we think about it, when we're in currently today, I mean, everybody gets on and they do it today where you can log on to a website. You don't know how much of your personal data has been shared online, what happens to that data, or how much of that information has been sold or outsourced. So the transparency with GDPR is going to, and the consent is also going to give you as the data subject all of that information so that you know exactly what's happening to your data. And that's why it's so important to do that data mapping, so you know that you can provide that information back to your data subject.
Excellent. Out of curiosity, are there any tools, switching to technology for a moment, are there any tools or organizations that a healthcare company should look to that you're thinking about when you think about data classification or data mapping, or what would you recommend? Where do they start?
I think the first thing they need to do is look at looking at their security risk and being able to first do that high level and looking at from doing an analysis of everything that's in their system. How much data do I actually have to have? What am I doing with that data? How long do I need to keep that data? What needs to be, how long do I need to store it? Why do I need to store it? Do I even need to have it? So actually going in and looking at what you do today and doing a step-by-step process of what you need to have done, why you're collecting the data, what is it used for, having all of that information, and then actually looking at it, can I delete this data if absolutely necessary, and do I have a communication plan to the data subject and internally about how we're going to delete that data? So actually coming up with a process and a plan. And there are several different companies that can do a lot of that stuff, but one of the biggest things that we here at ClearDATA do is we do those we look at your security risk so that we can make sure we can start looking at how that data is pulled and where that data is at.
Excellent. It makes sense. I know that, oftentimes we hear a lot on the technology side around really high level requirements as it relates to HIPAA. And there's lots of confusion in the market around things like encryption and storage and certificates and these kind of things. How does GDPR address those things? And I'm curious because one of your comments was really focused on more specificity. So how does that relate in terms of technology requirements?
So GDPR has these, and HIPAA as well, they both have very strict guidelines about being able to protect that high security, being able to protect that data. So what we're looking to do is make sure that you have the ability to pull in all of the data subjects information and then have that data mapping there. So being able to know that at any point in time when you're transporting the data, it was encrypted at all times. And GDPR requires that kind of adherence, and making sure that you know where your data is stored and whether it's in a different country or whether it's in your country, but who's accessing that data, who's viewing that data, who's downloading that data. And so that's one of the things that at ClearDATA, we are working on pulling together that visualization of that data map to show where your data is at, who's accessing that data, and what part of that data is going to is viewable, accessible, and stored. So you really understand where everything is at. And at the same time, if you decide that you want to, make sure that you provide a data mapping for that, that's something that we're looking into, is also creating that area where you can kind of separate that data out. So you know where your high-level sensitive data is at, and you have full control over the structure of that data. So it's encrypted in transit and at rest, so that you have those security protocols around that data.
Excellent. Okay, that makes sense. As you think about the penalties, I'll be, candidly, the very first time that I sat and I talked to a healthcare organization around GDPR, it wasn't around security. It was instead around consequences. So, I'd love to hear from you. What are the possible consequences of non-compliance from a GDPR perspective?
And that's what we've heard from our customers as well. It's not so much how can I be compliant with GDPR? How can I not be fined? And so that's really one of the biggest things that that's the main focus of everybody's mindset, is the fact that it's that 4% of your gross domestic profit across your whole organization, or it can be up to 20 million pounds, or as that translates into US. So that's probably one of the biggest, and that's per incident. That's one of the biggest caveats that everybody thinks about first. They're always thinking of at the end of the day that how can I stay compliant to avoid that? And a couple of ways that we at ClearDATA have kind of looked at that. We've looked at it several different ways, but one of the biggest things is how do we keep you in compliance so that doesn't happen, so that you can, sleep better at night, so you can have that sense of security, that compliance culture, and that ability to understand and visualize what's happening in your environment. Because having all that visibility after the fact is not going to help the fact that you've had a breach and the repercussions from a breach. So we want to make sure that we start answering that, how can we get you compliant, be very proactive and make sure that we get you compliant before GDPR comes into fruition, versus waiting till afterwards and something bad happens and then everybody has to scramble. And as we talk to our customers, that has been their biggest concern as well, is making sure I'm compliant and how can I prove my compliancy, and really understand how that visualization of my compliance prior to GDPR being enacted. Excellent.
I'd love to know, obviously at ClearDATA, a lot of the focus is on public cloud and how to align things like business associates agreements and HIPAA reg, as well as things like high trust and GXP and other really compliance considerations, and still use public cloud infrastructure. how do you see, or how have you seen kind of the public cloud players, whether it's Microsoft or AWS or Google or even IBM, how have you seen those organizations start to approach GDPR with their services?
It's really funny because Microsoft and AWS have both taken an approach to really start looking at the underlying infrastructure and how they can make that compliant. And even both of them have gone and made sure that they look at the full EU versus just looking at GDPR, because there are member states like Germany is looking for you to be not only GDPR but C5 compliant. So they're going out and making sure that they're compliant with not only the certification boards, which the EU has a certification board, but also making sure that they're compliant within those member states. So they're working on their infrastructure and bringing that infrastructure into compliance around access management and the encryption of certain pieces of that infrastructure. The problem underlies is as you build out applications on top of that infrastructure, there's that security by design that you have to have in place to protect that data subject and all the data attached to that subject. So that's where ClearDATA comes into play, is being able to build on top of what AWS and Microsoft and Google and Alibaba Cloud have all done to make sure that not only is the underlying infrastructure compliant for GDPR and working with each one of those cloud organizations, but also the top level that the customer is going to put on, how can we make sure that we not only tightly monitor and track that environment to make sure no configurations pull them out of compliance, but make sure that we keep that top layer compliant and add that visibility into the infrastructure.
Okay, excellent. That makes sense. And just a check-in here, if you're just tuning in, I'm Matt Ferrari of CTOTalk, and you're talking to myself and Saundra Monroe, our senior product manager at ClearDATA. We're talking about what you should know about GDPR, thinking about both HIMSS as well as May. Saundra, speaking of May, and I alluded to it earlier, and then I forgot to ask, can you kind of talk about what's happening in May regarding to the GDPR and the rollout, what folks should expect there?
So in May, the GDPR becomes fully enacted. They've done a little bit of test up to this point, and they are not backing down. May 25th of this year GDPR will be enacted. And so as ClearDATA is taking that stance, we're looking at what we can do to make sure you stay compliant. So currently we have things around access management, audit log, encryption, configuration changes, and making sure your storage has high security and vulnerability scanning and management around that as well. Those are all pieces that absolutely must be there by May 25th, but we're also looking at adding additional features around being able to provide that visibility. So as we look to May 25th, we are really kind of staying ahead of the game with what the industry is asking for and what the industry is requiring, and looking at how we can provide that visibility back, because May 25th is going to come, and as soon as they flip that switch, it's the worst thing you want to do is find out you're not compliant after that flip. So you want to make sure that you are totally compliant before that switch is being flipped.
Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about upcoming GDPR requirements and what organizations like ClearDATA can ultimately do. How do they best get engaged? Whether it's ClearDATA or someone else. What are kind of some of the early questions that you would ask a healthcare organization? Obviously beyond data classification, what kind of questions would you be asking a healthcare organization as they kind of try to tackle this beast?
Probably the first thing is to find out if they're even part of GDPR, and if they are, why do they consider they're part of GDPR? If they feel like they are under the GDPR guideline, what makes them feel that way? Is it because they have data transferred to them, or is it because they actually actively recruit and market to EU residents or data subjects? Finding out exactly what makes them within that, so then we can start working with them to tailoring a compliance around what they actually, their involvement with the EU is, and how they are under the guidelines of GDPR. We want to make sure that they're not over protecting when they don't need to, but not under protecting when they should. So we really need to kind of first ask those questions. Why do they feel like they need to be part of GDPR, and really helping them tailor that to that entity.
Okay. You know, I forgot to ask, as I was doing some reading on the topic last night, I was thinking about analytics, and I was thinking about, aligning data with policies. Have you seen organizations already start to put together, a swath of policies that are going to, align from like an optimal governance perspective? Are there templates out there? Thinking again beyond the technology for a moment, how does the technology component align with governance and all the policies that are going to, roll up to a CIO ultimately?
And I think that's a good question, because I think that's even something that we've had to address in our own organization, is we need to make sure that we have that single pane of glass. So all of the policies that an organization has to have, whether they're a HIPAA house and a GDPR house or a GDPR house, no matter what, all those policies need to align with the way your environment runs today. So being able to align and pull all of that together under one single pane of glass. So as you know, and I know that's an organizational issue that every organization that we've talked to is like, yeah, I have my policies over here, I have my infrastructure and my IT stuff over here, and then I have this visualization that you have that I have to align with everything else. So everybody's going to different places, and having the ability to have all that under one single pane of glass. So we understand that that's definitely an area that we have to start addressing, and I know that we're not the only ones that are doing that, because that is something that everyone's looking at. It's just being able to provide that single pane of glass, that having those SOPs and everything that you need for you to be compliant with GDPR, HIPAA, or whatever other framework or regulatory board that you have to be compliant with, that all of that is under one single pane of glass.
Yeah, absolutely. I often think in that regard, even beyond GDPR, I think about the disconnect oftentimes between policy and reality. And I think about all of the change control and lack thereof in public cloud. And a lot of it comes down to, to both logging, but it also comes down to visibility. So less a question and more of a comment, I'd be happy to, you give your thoughts. But I think more and more as things like GDPR become into effect, I think what's going to occur is there's going to be a continuous convergence against, okay, you can log and you can show all of this stuff, but how does it ultimately map back to the business controls and what actually makes the healthcare organization feel safe and secure?
Exactly, and that's going to be the biggest thing, because as GDPR is just hitting that cusp of what transparency really means to a data subject, that transparency is going to grow as we think about it. There's no way it's not going to grow. So having that complete transparency, that single pane of glass, that not only an organization can really answer those questions about how we do things, and are we doing them the way we said we were doing them, and are we abiding by our own infrastructure and our own policies that we put in place in our organization. How can we prove that to an auditor, to a supervising authority in the EU? So we need to it's one of those things as organizations, we need to make sure that even if we have a policy, that policy is being tracked inside one of that single pane of glass. And I know that is something ClearDATA is taking very seriously this year, and that is going to be definitely a focus.
Absolutely. And finally, I guess my last question, you brought up security by design earlier, and I'd love to understand your kind of thoughts on that. And I was reading last night around, how to integrate or incorporate security by design into technical systems as you consider your readiness towards GDPR. Do you have any kind of final thoughts there?
I think that the best way that we're going to incorporate security by design is creating those the templates that all of these security configurations are there, and they have to be they align with regulations and rules and frameworks. So you, instead of just being able to spin up a cloud environment and do whatever you want on that environment, is going to be a day of the past, because you have to abide by certain security guidelines and guardrails to safeguard that data subject's information. And this is the first time that the data subject is going to be able to understand how their data is being controlled and maintained. So having those templates that actually allow us to do that and really safeguard the data is going to be the biggest thing. And being able to utilize the cloud is the best way to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Saundra, I appreciate your time. Thank you for taking the time today. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. For what it's worth, just a sidebar, I'd encourage folks to keep your eye out on this. What I believe is going to occur is you're going to see some lessons learned, some trial by fire, some folks that, walk in very unprepared. And out of that should come case studies, right, and best practices. So I would bet Saundra and I are going to be talking about that in a couple months again. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in today. If you have a comment about today's episode, check out and follow #CTOTalk on Twitter or follow me at @MPFerrari. You can always learn more about CTOTalk at healthcarenowradio.com or at ClearDATA.com. I'm Matt Ferrari, and until we talk again, have a great week.